Archivist Saloon had waited 300 years for this day, and now that it had finally arrived, she could barely keep her 4 hands from trembling. The grand reliquary of Vathos Prime was alive with light and sound, and the murmur of 1,000 alien voices echoing off walls made of crystallized starlight. The orbital museum was the size of a small moon, built over tens of thousands of years by the conclave of elder species. And today, it held more dignitaries and scholars and priests than it had held in living memory. Every balcony was full. Every corridor was packed. Every species that had ever built a ship and sailed it between the stars had sent someone here to witness what was about to happen. The rite of presentation. Saloon stood at her observation post high above the central chamber, her monitoring equipment humming softly around her. She adjusted one of her 4 arms to recalibrate a scanner, while another held a data tablet, and the remaining 2 gripped the rail of the platform, railing because her legs felt weak. She was old by Vitheran standards, her pale blue skin lined with the silver marks of age, and she had spent most of her long life studying the thing that sat on the dais below. The skull of Aethon. It rested on a pedestal of black stone in the exact center of the chamber, bathed in a column of soft white light. It was not made of bone despite its name. It was a crystalline construct shaped like the cranium of some unknown being, smooth and dark as the space between galaxies, and threaded through with veins of gold that caught the light like frozen lightning. It was roughly the size of a human torso, and it was, by every measurement that science could offer, the oldest artificial object ever discovered in the known universe, 2 million years old at minimum. It had been found inside the collapsed core of a dead star, sealed within layers of compressed matter that should have crushed it into atoms. The fact that it survived was impossible. The fact that it existed at all was a mystery that had haunted every civilization that had ever looked upon it. And no one had ever made it do anything. Not once in the thousands of years since its discovery had the skull responded to any stimulus. Saloon herself had tried everything. She had bombarded it with radiation and sound and electromagnetic pulses. She had watched others attempt psionic contact, chemical interaction, and even prayer. It sat on its pedestal, and it did nothing. It was beautiful and ancient, and completely, maddeningly silent. Today, the conclave had organized the rite of presentation as both a diplomatic ceremony and a scientific experiment. Every spacefaring species would approach the skull one at a time, formally introducing themselves to the relic, while Saloon and her team recorded every possible reading. The hope was that perhaps one species, one specific biological signature, might trigger something. The Drenari went first because they always went first. Their high prelate, a towering figure draped in robes of woven metal, knelt before the skull and spoke words of reverence in a voice that shook the air. The Drenari believed the skull was the remains of a god, and they treated it accordingly. The skull did nothing. The Kethval came next, a delegation of small crystalline beings who communicated through harmonic frequencies. They surrounded the skull and sang to it, their bodies chiming like bells in a pattern so complex that Saloon's equipment could barely track it. The skull did nothing. The Ul Rashin stepped forward, massive and slow, their collective consciousness reaching out with psionic tendrils that Saloon could see on her scanners, as bright threads of energy probing the relic. The skull did nothing. One by one they came, the proud Halvanti with their wings folded in respect, the ancient Moruk who claimed to remember when the skull was first found, the Tesserai who brought offerings of rare minerals, the Jin who simply stood and stared with their hundreds of eyes. Nothing and nothing and nothing again. Hours passed. Saloon's hope dimmed with each failed attempt. She watched her readings stay flat, and felt the familiar weight of disappointment settle into her chest. 300 years of study, and still the skull kept its secrets. Near the end of the ceremony, when many dignitaries had already begun to lose interest, and quiet conversations had started to fill the upper galleries, the announcer called the next delegation. The United Earth Confederacy. Saloon barely looked up. Humanity was the newest species on the galactic stage, barely 3 centuries into their spacefaring existence. They were considered clever and adaptable, but ultimately unremarkable. A young species still finding its footing among civilizations that had sailed the stars for millennia. Their delegation was small, almost embarrassingly so compared to the grand processions that had come before. A woman walked forward, flanked by 2 aides and a pair of soldiers in simple dark uniforms. She was of average height, with dark hair pulled back, and a calm expression that suggested she was trying very hard not to look overwhelmed. Her name, according to the registry, was Captain Ilara Voss, and she was a mid-ranking diplomat who had probably been assigned this duty because no one more senior thought it was worth their time. Saloon glanced at her instruments, out of habit, more than expectation. Then, every single one of them screamed. The readings spiked so hard and so fast that 2 of her monitors cracked. Saloon grabbed the railing with all 4 hands and stared down at the dais with her mouth open. The skull was moving. For the first time in recorded history, the skull of Aethon shifted on its pedestal. The golden veins inside it blazed to life, pulsing with a warm, steady rhythm like a heartbeat, and the entire crystalline structure tilted forward slowly and deliberately. It was bowing. The grand reliquary fell silent in a way that Saloon had never experienced before. It was not the silence of a quiet room. It was the silence of 1,000 beings, all holding their breath at exactly the same moment. Ilara Voss had frozen mid-step. Her aides stood behind her with wide eyes. One of the soldiers had his hand on his weapon, though what he intended to do with it against a 2-million-year-old relic was unclear. The skull held its bow for exactly 7 seconds. Then it rose back to its original position. The golden veins continued to pulse, filling the chamber with a warm light that made the white column above it look cold by comparison. And then it began to hum. The sound was deep and resonant, vibrating through the floor and the walls and the bones of every being present. Saloon looked at her one surviving monitor and felt her blood go cold. The frequency was a precise match, the default neural oscillation pattern of the human brain. Ilara Voss stood alone on the dais before an object older than her entire species, an object that had ignored every civilization in the galaxy for thousands of years, and she did the only thing that felt right. She bowed her head in return. The silence broke like a wave, and the chaos began. The chaos lasted for 3 hours, before the Conclave security forces managed to restore something close to order, and even then, the grand reliquary hummed with a tension that Saloon could feel in her teeth. She had never seen anything like it. Delegates who had maintained centuries of careful diplomatic composure were shouting across the chamber. The Drenari High Prelate had declared the event a blasphemy and demanded the humans be removed immediately. The Kethval ambassador was vibrating at a frequency that meant either deep excitement or murderous rage, and Saloon honestly could not tell which. The Ulrashin collective had withdrawn into itself and gone completely silent, which was somehow more unnerving than all the shouting combined. And through all of it, the skull of Aethon continued to hum its deep and steady song, its golden veins pulsing with light that matched the rhythm of a human heartbeat. Ilara Voss stood at the edge of the dais, surrounded by her small delegation, looking remarkably composed for someone who had just become the most controversial figure in galactic history. Her 2 aides flanked her, with expressions that alternated between terror and awe, while the Marine escort had formed a tight protective circle around her, not because anyone had threatened violence, but because the weight of 1,000 alien stares felt like a physical force. "Captain Voss," Saloon said, as she pushed through the crowd toward the human delegation, her forearms clearing a path with polite but firm efficiency. "I am Archivist Saloon, lead researcher assigned to the skull. I need to speak with you immediately." Alara looked at the Vytheran with steady brown eyes. "I would appreciate that, because I have absolutely no idea what just happened." Saloon guided the humans to a secure observation alcove above the main floor, while her assistants worked frantically to replace the monitoring equipment that had burned out during the skull's activation. Below them, the conclave delegates had broken into clusters of urgent conversation, and Saloon could see political alliances forming and breaking in real time, like cracks spreading through ice. "The skull of Aethon has been studied for thousands of years," Saloon said, as she pulled up her surviving data on a holographic display. "It has never responded to any species in any way until today. Until you." "Why us?" Alara asked, and it was not really a question so much as a demand for the universe to make sense. "That is what I intend to find out," Saloon replied. Saloon's remaining instruments were still recording, and what they showed made her hearts beat faster. The golden veins inside the skull were no longer random patterns. They were organizing themselves into structures, and those structures were unmistakable. "Captain Voss, do you know what a double helix looks like?" Alara stared at the holographic display, and Saloon watched the color drain from the human's face. "DNA," Alara said quietly. "That is a human DNA structure." "Yes," Saloon confirmed, and even her scientific detachment could not keep the tremor from her voice. "The relic is displaying the molecular structure of your species, as if it recognizes it, as if it has been waiting for it." Below them, the Drenari High Prelate had taken the central floor and was addressing the assembled delegates in a voice that carried like thunder. "This is a manipulation," he declared. "The humans have somehow tampered with the sacred relic. Their technology is crude, but they are known to be cunning. We demand a full investigation and the immediate removal of the human delegation from Vythos Prime." A ripple of agreement passed through several delegations, but not all. The Kethvol ambassador chimed a sharp note of dissent, and the Tesserae representative raised a crystalline hand for silence. "The relic chose," the Tesserae said in their slow, measured way. "We came here to see if it would respond, and it responded. We do not get to be angry at the answer simply because it was not the answer we wanted." The argument erupted again, and Saloon turned away from it. She had spent 3 centuries studying the skull, and she was not about to let politics get in the way of the most significant scientific event in galactic history. "I need to run more scans," she told Alara. "I need to understand why the skull responded to your species, and not to any other. But the Conclave is going to place your delegation under protective custody within the hour. I can already see the security teams moving into position." Alara's jaw tightened. "We are diplomats, not prisoners. I understand that, and I will argue on your behalf. But you need to understand the situation you are in, Captain. Every species in this room has spent centuries or millennia believing that the skull might respond to them. You walked in, and it bowed to you in front of all of them. That is not just a scientific event. That is a political earthquake." Alara was quiet for a moment. Then she turned to one of her aides. "Lieutenant Park, I need you to send a tight beam transmission to Earth Command. Highest encryption, priority 1. "What should the message say, Captain?" Alara looked down at the skull, still glowing on its pedestal, still humming its song for her species alone. "Tell them something ancient knows what we are, and tell them I need someone much higher ranking than me to come deal with this, because I am way out of my depth." Despite everything, Saloon felt a small flicker of respect for the human. The galaxy was watching, and the weight of 2 million years of mystery had just landed on this woman's shoulders, and she was honest enough to admit she was overwhelmed. Most species would have puffed themselves up and claimed destiny. Alara Voss simply asked for help. The Conclave voted within the hour, As Saloon had predicted, the humans were placed under protective custody, officially for their own safety, though everyone understood it was really to keep them contained until the elder species could decide what to do. A research commission was formed with Saloon at its head, because no elder species trusted any other elder species to lead it, and the Vytherans were considered neutral enough to be acceptable. The skull continued to hum. Over the next several days, Saloon ran every test she could devise, and each result deepened the mystery. The skull's energy output had increased by a factor of 9,000 since Alara's approach. It was broadcasting on frequencies that matched human neural patterns with a precision that could not be coincidental. And the golden veins continued to shift and change, forming new patterns that Saloon's team was only beginning to catalog. But the most disturbing discovery came on the fourth day, when Saloon asked Alara to approach the skull again under controlled conditions. As Alara stepped within 10 meters, skull's hum changed pitch, and a new pattern formed in the golden veins. This time, it was not a DNA helix. It was a star map. Saloon recognized some of the star positions immediately, but they were wrong. The stars were not where they should be. They were in positions that corresponded to the galaxy as it had been approximately 2 million years ago. The skull was showing them the sky as it had looked when someone had built it. And scattered across that ancient sky, certain stars were marked, highlighted in brighter gold, pulsing with urgency, as if to say, here, and here, and here. Look at these places. Remember these places. Saloon stared at the map, with all 4 hands pressed flat against her console, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Fear. Because she recognized some of those marked systems. They were places where ruins of unknown origin had been found, scattered across the galaxy. Ruins that no species had ever been able to explain. That predated every known civilization, and now the skull was connecting them all like points on a map that no one had ever known how to read. Until now. Until a human walked into the room, and the oldest object in the universe decided after 2 million years of silence that it was finally time to start talking. 3 weeks had passed since the skull of Aethon had bowed to a human, and the galaxy had not calmed down even slightly. Saloon worked in a secured research wing deep inside the reliquary, surrounded by equipment that had been rushed in from 6 different worlds. Her team had grown from 3 assistants to 47 researchers, but the one addition that mattered most was the small group of humans that the Conclave had grudgingly permitted to join the study. Their leader was a man named Dr. Mateo Reyes, a xenoarchaeologist from a place on Earth called Sao Paulo. He arrived with 2 suitcases of personal belongings, a battered notebook filled with hand-drawn sketches of alien ruins, and a smile so warm that it seemed to confuse every non-human who encountered it. Saloon did not know what to make of him at first. "So you are the one who has been staring at this thing for 300 years, Mateo said when they first met, extending his hand in a human greeting. "Gesture. That is dedication. I usually lose interest in my research subjects after about 3 years." "The skull is not a research subject," Saloon corrected him stiffly. "It is the most significant artifact in galactic history." Right, of course," Mateo said, but his eyes were already moving past her to the skull, visible through the observation window. And the grin on his face was not the grin of a man who took things too lightly. It was the grin of a man who had just found exactly what he had been looking for his entire life. They worked poorly together at first. Saloon was methodical and precise, moving through the research protocols with the patience of someone who measured time in centuries. Mateo was intuitive and chaotic, jumping between ideas and making connections that seemed random until they suddenly were not. He left coffee cups on her equipment, and she rearranged his notes when he was not looking. They argued about methodology at least 4 times a week. day. But they also made progress faster than either of them could have alone. The critical discovery came on the 9th day. Saloon had determined that the skull was not just broadcasting outward, it was assembling something internally, building a structure within its crystalline matrix, like a message being composed one letter at a time. But the assembly process only advanced when a human was in proximity. Without a human present, it paused and waited with the patience of something that had already waited 2 million years and could wait 2 million more. "It needs us nearby," Matteo said when Saloon showed him the data. "Like a key in a lock." "More like a catalyst," Saloon corrected. "Your biological presence triggers the process, but the process itself is something the skull is doing on its own. You are not controlling it, you are enabling it." Matteo volunteered to sit beside the skull for extended periods, and the conclave approved it after 3 days of debate. Nearly fractured the coalition. He sat in a chair next to the pedestal with monitoring equipment attached to his temples and chest, while Saloon watched from behind reinforced glass, with her 4 hands ready on emergency shutdown controls she was not entirely sure would work. On the first day of direct proximity sessions, the skull projected the star map again, larger and more detailed than before. Matteo described what he saw, while Saloon recorded everything, and cross-referenced the marked systems with known archaeological sites. On the second day, the skull began adding new information to the map, lines connecting the marked systems like a network or a web. Saloon identified the pattern as resembling a transportation grid of some kind. Highways between stars built by someone who had mapped the galaxy long before any living species had learned to make fire. On the third day, the skull did something that changed everything. Matteo was sitting in his usual chair when the air above the pedestal shimmered, and a figure appeared. A holographic projection rendered in golden light, so detailed that Saloon could see individual strands of hair. It was a person, standing upright on 2 legs, with 2 arms, and a face that had 2 eyes, and a nose, and a mouth, and an expression of calm determination that transcended species and time. It was unmistakably, undeniably human, or something so close to human that the difference was invisible. Matteo stood up slowly, his chair scraping back across the floor. He stared at the figure, and the figure stared back at him across an impossible gulf of time, with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of something vast and sorrowful. "Saloon," Matteo said, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "That person lived 2 million years ago." "Yes," Saloon replied, and her own voice was not much steadier. 2 million years before my species supposedly evolved on Earth. Yes, Earth was not what we thought it was. Or, your species did not originate on your world," Saloon finished for him. "Or you are not the first iteration of what you are. Someone or something with your exact genetic pattern existed before, long before, and they built all of this." Matteo reached out toward the holographic figure, and it shifted in response, turning to look at him with those ancient familiar eyes. Then it spoke. Not in any language that existed, not in sound at all. The skull transmitted the meaning directly into Matteo's mind, and he gasped and grabbed the edge of the pedestal to keep from falling. "What did it say?" Saloon demanded, pressing against the glass. Matteo took several breaths before he could answer. "It said we are the Aethani, and we remember you before you existed." The projection changed. The single figure dissolved, and was replaced by a sweeping panoramic vision of a civilization. Cities that floated between worlds. Space like birds through air. Structures built around stars themselves, harnessing their energy with an elegance that made every existing civilization's technology look like children playing with rocks. The Aethani had been everywhere. They had touched every corner of the galaxy, and the ruins that dozens of species had puzzled over for millennia were their fingerprints left behind in stone and metal and light. Then the vision darkened. The stars at the edge of the galaxy began to go out. Not exploding, not dying, just vanishing, as if something was erasing them one by one. a wave of absence, spreading inward, consuming everything it touched, not with fire or force, but with a nothingness so complete that even the memory of what had been there seemed to dissolve. "What is that?" Matteo breathed. The skull answered with a single word that burned itself into his consciousness like a brand. "The Fade." Saloon watched Matteo's face go pale, watched him grip the pedestal until his knuckles turned white, watched the golden light of the projection paint shadows across his features that made him look very old and very young at the same time. "Saloon," he said, and when he looked up at her his eyes were wet. "They are all gone. The Aethoni are gone, all of them. They burned their entire civilization to stop that thing from eating the galaxy. They used themselves as fuel, every city, every ship, every person. They converted it all into energy to build a barrier at the edge of everything, and it cost them all of it." The projection showed it, the great burning, a civilization of billions choosing extinction to save a galaxy that would never know their names. Stars flaring bright with the energy of sacrificed worlds, a wall of light rising at the galaxy's rim, holding back the darkness. And then silence, the stars returning to their normal patterns, the galaxy continuing to turn as if nothing had happened. Alive. The skull's golden veins dimmed to a soft glow, and the projection faded, leaving Matteo standing alone beside the pedestal in a room that felt much larger and much emptier than it had before. Saloon entered the chamber and stood beside him, neither of them speaking for a long time. Finally, Matteo looked at her and asked the question she had been dreading. If they built the skull to be found by someone with their DNA, and if that someone is us, then the skull is not just a record, is it? "No," Saloon said quietly. "It is a warning." "The Fade," Matteo said. "It is still out there behind the barrier." "Yes, and the barrier is 2 million years old." Saloon closed her eyes. "Yes." Matteo looked back at the skull, sitting dark and patient on its pedestal, an object built by people who looked exactly like him, who had loved this galaxy enough to die for it, and who had placed their last hope in the thin, desperate chance that evolution would someday produce their pattern again. "Then who were they really?" he asked softly. "And what happens when the barrier breaks?" The skull pulsed once with golden light, as if to say, "That is exactly the right question." The conclave chamber had never been so full or so quiet. Every seat was occupied. Every balcony was standing room only. Species that had not spoken to each other in centuries stood shoulder to shoulder, or shoulder to wing, or shoulder to tentacle, depending on their anatomy. And all of them stared at the holographic display floating above the central floor, where the evidence of what the skull had revealed was laid out in light and silence. Ilara Voss stood at the speaking platform with Matteo beside her and Saloon behind them, both operating the display controls with all 4 hands. The 3 of them had spent 2 days preparing this presentation, knowing that what they were about to share would either unite the galaxy or shatter it. Ilara spoke first, and her voice carried clearly across the vast chamber, without wavering, even though Saloon could see her hands trembling slightly at her sides. 3 weeks ago, the skull of Aethon responded to human presence, for reasons none of us understood. Since then, Dr. Reyes and Archivist Saloon have been working to decode the information stored within the relic. What we have found changes everything we thought we knew about the history of this galaxy, and I will not soften it because you deserve the truth. She nodded to Saloon, who activated the first projection. The Aethoni appeared above the chamber, golden figures of light going about their lives, building their cities, sailing their ships, tending to worlds that were not their own. The assembled delegates watched in stunned silence as the projection showed the Aethoni arriving at young civilizations, not as conquerors, but as gardeners, carefully nurturing the conditions for life to flourish, and then withdrawing, leaving behind only the faintest traces of their presence. They called themselves the Aethoni, Ilara continued. They were genetically identical to modern humans, and they existed 2 million years before humanity evolved on Earth. Civilization that spanned the entire galaxy, and their purpose was not conquest, it was caretaking. They seeded worlds with life. They guided young species toward growth. They maintained the balance of the galactic ecosystem, and many of the worlds you call home exist as they do because the Aethoni made them that way. A murmur ran through the chamber, but no one interrupted. Saloon shifted the projection, and the stars at the galaxy's edge began to disappear. The chamber grew colder as delegates watched the fade creep inward, that terrible wave of nothingness that did not destroy so much as erase. Something came from the void between galaxies, Alara said, and her voice was harder now, carrying the weight of what she had seen through the skull's projections. The Aethoni called it the Fade. It was not an army or a weapon, it was an entropy, a force that consumed stars and worlds and civilizations by making them simply cease to exist, not destroyed, not killed, forgotten, reality as if they had never been. The projection showed the Aethoni fighting ships that burned like small suns, weapons that tore holes in the fabric of space itself, and none of it enough. The Fade kept coming, patient and absolute and hungry, in a way that had nothing to do with desire, and everything to do with inevitability. The Aethoni fought for millennia, Matteo said, stepping forward to take over, because Alara's voice had begun to crack. And when they realized they could not win, they made a choice. They converted their entire civilization into energy. Every ship, every station, every city, every world they had built, they burned all of it, including themselves, to create a barrier at the edge of the galaxy, a wall of pure force that pushed the Fade back and held it there. The projection showed the great burning, and the chamber was absolutely silent now. Saloon watched the faces of 1,000 delegates and saw the same expression on all of them, regardless of species, horrified awe at a sacrifice so vast that the mind could barely contain it. They knew what they were giving up, Matteo continued, and before the end, they created the skull's relics, keyed to their own DNA, scattered across the galaxy as both a record of what had happened and a contingency. They knew that evolution follows patterns. They knew that given enough time and enough worlds, their genetic signature would emerge again somewhere. It was not a matter of if, but of when. The skull did not bow to worship us, Alara said, reclaiming the floor. It bowed in recognition. The way you greet someone you have been waiting for. The way you acknowledge a face you know, even if the person wearing it is someone new. We are not the Aethoni. We did not build their cities or sail their ships. But we carry their pattern, and the skull was designed to find that pattern and activate when it did. She paused, and Saloon could see her gathering herself for the part that would hurt. More thing. The skull's data includes readings of the barrier. It is still there. It is held for 2 million years, but it is weakening. The chamber erupted. Saloon had expected it. She watched as delegates leaped to their feet, shouting questions and accusations and demands. The Dranari High Prelate called for an immediate military mobilization. The Kethval ambassador demanded to see the raw data. The Tesserae representative sat in perfect stillness, processing the information with the slow, deliberate patience of their kind. And underneath all the noise, several delegates were looking at the human delegation with expressions that Saloon recognized all too well. Not admiration, not respect, fear. Because if the skull only responded to humans, and if the ancient technology was keyed to human neurology, and if the barrier was failing, then humanity had just gone from being the galaxy's newest and least important species to being the single most critical factor in the world. Survival of everything. And that kind of power made people afraid. The arguments went on for hours. Factions formed and dissolved and reformed. Saloon listened to proposals that ranged from the reasonable to the desperate. Some wanted to study the skulls further. Others wanted to destroy them before anyone could weaponize the technology. Some wanted to lock the humans away and use them as living keys to access Athoni secrets. Others wanted to pretend none of this had happened and go back to their comfortable ignorance. It was Ilara who finally cut through the noise. She did not shout. She did not bang on the podium or make dramatic gestures. She simply walked back to the speaking platform and stood there, waiting until the weight of her silence drew the chamber's attention back to her. "You have spent millennia wondering what the skull was waiting for," she said. "Now you know. It was waiting for us. And I understand that this frightens you. It frightens me too. I am mid-ranking diplomat from a species that has been spacefaring for 3 centuries. I am not qualified for this. No human is." She looked around the chamber, meeting eyes and optical sensors and psionic receptors one by one. "But here is what I know. The Athoni carried this burden alone. They faced the fade by themselves, and it cost them everything. They were a single species trying to save an entire galaxy, and they could not do it without losing themselves in the process." Her voice grew stronger. "We will not make their mistake. The skull responds to us, yes. The technology is keyed to our biology, yes. But that makes us a key, not a leader. A key is useless without a hand to turn it. We are not here to rule or to command. We are here because an accident of genetics put us in this position, and we are asking, not demanding, asking for your help." She stepped back from the platform. "The fade is coming. Whether it arrives in 100 years or 1,000, it is coming. It will not care which species is oldest or most powerful or most proud. It will erase all of us equally. The only question is whether we face it together, or whether we let the same fear and pride that could not save the Athoni destroy us before the fade even arrives." The chamber was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence than before. It was the silence of people thinking, truly thinking about what had been said. Saloon watched from her position behind the display, and felt something shift in the room. Something small but real, like the first crack in a dam that had been holding back a river. The Drenari High Prelate was the first to speak, and what he said surprised everyone, including himself. "The human speaks wisdom," he said slowly, as if the words cost him something precious. "We will listen." It was not agreement. It was not alliance. It was barely even an acknowledgement. But it was a door opening by the smallest crack, and Saloon knew from 3 centuries of patient work that sometimes the smallest crack was all you needed. Ilara caught Saloon's eye across the chamber, and the human gave the tiniest nod of gratitude. A silent thank you for standing behind her on that platform, for lending the credibility of 300 years of research to the words of a species the galaxy had barely noticed a month ago. Saloon nodded back, with all 4 hands folded in the Vytheran gesture of respect. The galaxy had changed today. Whether it had changed enough remained to be seen. 6 months had passed since the skull of Athon bowed to a human, and nothing in the galaxy was the same. Seluin stood on the bridge of the Vytheran flagship Endless Patience and watched through the observation window as ships from 37 different species assembled in formation around them. It was the largest combined fleet in galactic history, and it had come together through a combination of fear and hope and stubbornness that she suspected would be studied by historians for millennia to come. Assuming there were millennia to come, assuming they succeeded in what they were about to do. The coalition had not formed easily. Nothing worth building ever did. On Earth, the revelation of the Athoni legacy had split humanity down the middle. Some embraced it with a fervor that bordered on religious, calling it destiny and purpose and proof that humanity was special. Others rejected it, calling it a burden they had never asked for, and a manipulation by forces they did not understand, Protests erupted in dozens of cities, and governments debated endlessly about whether to accept the galactic role that had been thrust upon them. But the volunteers came anyway. They came from every nation and every background, scientists and soldiers, and engineers and doctors, and people who had no particular skill, but who simply felt, in some deep and wordless part of themselves, that this was important. They showed up at recruitment centers and research stations and said the same thing in 100 different languages. What do you need us to do? Across the galaxy, the other skulls had begun to wake. One by one, responding to the signal from the first, they activated on worlds and in ruins and inside dead stations that had drifted silent for 2 million years. Each skull contained a fragment of Athoni knowledge, and as human teams reached each one, the fragments connected like pieces of a puzzle that spanned the stars. Tesserai's system contained schematics for energy manipulation technology that could channel the output of a star. The skull, buried beneath the sand on a Drenari colony world, held designs for faster-than-light drives so advanced that they made existing technology look like wooden rafts compared to starships. The skull, floating in the gas clouds of the Halventi Nebula, projected blueprints for something the researchers simply called the Weave, a lattice of interconnected energy nodes that could reinforce the barrier at the galaxy's edge. But every skull required a human presence to function. The technology was written in a biological language that only human neural patterns could speak. Without a human nearby, the skulls were just beautiful stones. This was the part that had nearly broken the coalition. Several elder species resented the dependency. Some accused humanity of engineering the situation somehow, despite the obvious impossibility of a 3-century-old civilization. Faking 2-million-year-old relics. Others simply could not accept that the youngest species in the room held the key that the oldest ones could not turn. It was Selwyn who had argued most fiercely before the conclave, standing on the chamber floor with her silver-lined face set in an expression of absolute determination that surprised even her. "You are afraid of depending on them," she had said to the assembled delegates. "I understand this. I am a scientist, and I have spent my life depending on no one but myself and my instruments. But the evidence is not something we get to argue with. The skulls respond to humans. This is not a political position, it is a physical fact, and the barrier is failing, which is also a fact. And facts do not care about our pride." The vote had been close, but it had passed. The coalition was formed. Now Selwyn stood on the bridge of the flagship, watching it come together in real time. Vytheran cruisers, with their elegant silver hulls. Warships bristling with weapons that could crack moons. Kethval harmonic vessels that looked like frozen music made solid. Halventi carriers with wings that spread across kilometers of space. Tesserai crystal ships that refracted light into rainbows. And scattered among them all, the human vessels, smaller and simpler than the rest, but carrying crews that the skulls would only speak to. Ilara Voss arrived on the bridge wearing a uniform that was newer and bore more rank insignia than the one she had worn 6 months ago. The conclave had insisted on a shared command structure, and Ilara had been appointed as the human coordinator, not the leader of the fleet, but the essential link between the human skull-bearers and the combined military forces. She looked tired, Selwyn thought. Not the tiredness of someone who had not slept, but the tiredness of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and could not put it down. "The fleet is almost assembled," told her. The barrier readings show continued degradation at the galaxy's edge. Sectors 7 through 19 are showing the most significant weakening. Ilara nodded. Mateo's team has the Weave schematics loaded and ready. The Skull-Bearer teams are in position on every ship that is carrying a relic node. "How many skulls do we have active now?" 43, Selwyn said, out of an estimated 60 distributed across the galaxy. "We are still searching for the remaining 17, but 43 should be sufficient to initialize the Weave according to the specifications." Elara was quiet for a moment, looking out at the fleet. Then she said, "Saloon, there is something I have not told the Conclave yet." Saloon felt her forehands tighten. "What?" Mateo unlocked the final projection from the original skull this morning. The last message recorded before the Aethoni burned themselves out. What did it show? Elara turned to face her. It showed a woman. She could have been my sister. She recorded a message, and the skull translated it directly into Mateo's mind. He wrote it down word for word. Elara pulled a small piece of paper from her pocket, and Saloon was struck by how human that was. In a galaxy of holographic displays and neural interfaces, this woman carried the most important message in history on a folded piece of paper. She said this, Elara read, and her voice was steady, but her hands were not. "We held the line as long as we could. We burned everything we were, so that life could continue. We left these memories in stone and starlight, trusting that the shape of us would walk again. If you are hearing this, then we were right. You are the echo of what we were, but you do not have to be the echo of how we ended. You have what we did not. You are not alone. The others are with you now. Hold the line together." Saloon stood perfectly still as the words settled into her. She thought about the Aethoni woman who had recorded that message 2 million years ago, standing in the last moments of her civilization, knowing she was about to cease to exist, and choosing to spend those final moments, not in grief or rage, but in hope. Hope that someday someone who wore her face would stand where she had stood, and would not have to stand there alone. "The Conclave should hear this," Saloon said. "They will, but I wanted you to hear it first. You were the one who studied the skull for 300 years. You were the one who stood behind us when no one else would. You are the reason the Coalition exists as much as any human is." Saloon blinked her large pale eyes and said nothing, because some moments were too full for words. The fleet jumped. 37 species moving together through corridors of folded space toward the edge of everything. The journey took 11 hours, and during those hours Saloon watched the crew of the flagship go about their duties with a focus and intensity that transcended. Species Vitharan navigators plotted courses alongside human technicians. Drenari weapons officers coordinated firing solutions with Kethval harmonic engineers. Halventi scouts shared sensor data with Tesserae analysts. It was not perfect. There were arguments and misunderstandings, and moments where cultural differences nearly derailed critical operations. But every time things started to fracture, someone stepped forward and pulled them back together. And it was not always a human. Sometimes it was a Drenari officer who had never spoken to a human before, swallowing his pride to ask for help. Sometimes it was a Kethval who translated between two species that could not understand each other. Sometimes it was Saloon herself, standing in the middle of a disagreement, with all 4 arms raised, saying, "We do not have time for this, and the barrier does not care about your feelings." When they arrived at the galaxy's edge, Saloon saw the fade for the first time, and she understood immediately why the Aethoni had been afraid. It was not darkness. Darkness was simply the absence of light. This was the absence of everything, a wall of nothing stretching across the sky in every direction. And where it pressed against the barrier, the ancient lattice of Aethoni energy flickered and sparked and bent inward like a dam about to break. The barrier was failing. They could see it happening in real time. "All Skullbearer teams activate," Elara ordered, and across the fleet, 43 humans sitting beside 43 ancient relics opened their minds and let the skulls speak through them. The weave ignited. Lines of golden energy leaped from ship to ship, connecting the skulls in a pattern that mirrored the star map the first skull had shown them months ago. The energy flowed outward from the fleet and into the barrier, reinforcing it, strengthening it, weaving new threads of force into the ancient lattice like fresh rope braided into an old net. Not yet. The barrier needed more power, and the Atheni schematic showed them where to draw it from, the stars themselves. Energy channeled through the weave, from the nearest systems, feeding the barrier with the fire of suns. And still the Fade pressed inward, testing the reinforced barrier with the patient, inexorable pressure of something that had been waiting for 2 million years. But the barrier held. It bent, and it flexed, and it groaned with a sound that was felt rather than heard, but it held. On the bridge of the endless patience, Saloon stood beside Alara and watched the golden light of the weave paint the darkness with threads of fire. The skull of Athon, the first one, the one that had started everything, was mounted on the bridge at Alara's request, and it glowed with a warm, steady light that filled the room like sunlight through a window. It was not bowing now. It stood tall on its pedestal, its golden veins blazing with a brightness that Saloon had never seen in 300 years of study. As if after 2 million years of waiting in the dark, it was finally exactly where it was supposed to be. Saloon looked at the human standing beside her. This small, determined woman from a young species that had stumbled into an inheritance they had never asked for, and had chosen to carry it, not because they were the strongest or the wisest, but because it needed carrying, and they were willing. Your ancestors gave everything for a galaxy that would never remember them, Saloon said quietly. Alara watched the stars through the observation window, the barrier blazing gold against the darkness, a fleet of 37 species holding the line together, and she smiled. Then we will make sure it was worth it. The skull pulsed once, warm and bright and proud, and the barrier held, and the galaxy continued to turn. And for the first time in 2 million years, the ones who kept watch at the edge of everything were not alone.